In 1853, the Missouri Ozarks, they used twin brothers in their uncle and aunt's horrible bed experiments and then locked them up in the cellar. What happened next is very strange. Blackwood Hollow was quiet, and the cellar door was locked from the outside. When the sheriff broke it open, there were bodies chained to the walls and 2 ledgers between them. One was the twins' revenge diary, which was dirty. The other thing, in Jedediah Croft's hand, was years of documented abuse, strange medical texts, and a wife who had to go through a violent miscarriage on that floor. This is how the whole truth came out, thanks to records that were kept with terrifying accuracy. What could justice say when the jury read both books? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you're brave enough to go on this journey, subscribe so you don't miss stories that show the worst parts of human nature. The cold, bitter fall of 1853 brought an early frost to the Missouri Ozarks. This frost brought with it a silence that would break open one of the most disturbing cases in frontier justice. As he had done for almost 10 years, Reverend Michael Shaw made his seasonal rounds through Blackwood Hollow in late October. His route was always the same, and people knew when he would come. As he walked up to the Croft farm that cold morning, he expected Jedediah Croft to greet him with a stern look and Altha to offer him a simple meal. He found a house that looked like it was holding its breath instead. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, and no one answered his knock. The animals in the pen were thin and weak, and their water troughs were dry and cracked. Later, in sworn testimony, Shaw said that as he walked around the property calling out names that only the wind through bare trees answered, he felt an unnatural fear settle over him. The preacher was right to be worried. Jedediah Croft was a powerful man in the hollow, with a lot of land and property. His word was as good as scripture. Years before, after their parents died of fever, he took in his orphan twin nephews, Silas and Elias Kane. The community saw this as Christian charity from a strict but good man. People in the area said that Jedediah was tough but fair, and that he paid his debts on time and kept good records. People in town talked about Althea, his wife, as being quiet and pretty. They also talked about how she didn't have any children, which was a sign of pity for women who didn't do what was expected of them. The twins had come to the farm as shy boys of about 12 or 13. Over the years, they had become permanent residents, working the land with their heads always bowed. But something had changed in the last few months, and it had happened so slowly that no one could say exactly when it started. Later, the town storekeeper told Sheriff Augustus Ryland that Jedediah had started ordering strange things by mail in the spring before. The storekeeper got medical books, anatomical charts, and pamphlets with titles he couldn't quite remember but thought were strange for a farmer. He wrote down the dates and descriptions of these purchases in his ledger, which would later be added to the official case file. The twins, on the other hand, had changed from being shy to something else. People who saw them on the road said they had vacant eyes and flinching obedience that made even tough frontier people who were used to strict discipline feel uneasy. One farmer would say that they moved like beaten dogs, always together, always quiet, and finished their work with a mechanical accuracy that seemed inhuman. Althea's absence from public life was the most troubling thing. She used to go to church in town every week, but by summer she had stopped going altogether. People hadn't seen her in months. Reverend Shaw's report to the new county sheriff was very serious and made people very worried. Augustus Ryland was an outsider, a young cop who wanted to bring order to the lawless hills where family ties often meant more than the law. He got his job by promising to treat all men equally before the law, no matter where they lived or where they came from. When Shaw came to his office in early November to talk about the abandoned Croft farm, Ryland knew right away that something much worse than a simple family fight had happened. The county archive has a record of what the preacher said. It talked about an unnatural and long-lasting silence, animals that were close to death because they weren't being cared for, and a deep wrongness that was hard to explain. Ryland wasn't superstitious, but he trusted Shaw's judgment. The Reverend had been in these hills long enough to know when something was out of the ordinary. Sheriff Ryland rode out to the Croft farm with 2 deputies on the morning of the 3rd of November, 1853. He had a notebook with him and wrote down everything he saw in great detail. This habit would turn out to be very important for solving the case. He saw the farm spread out below, in the gray light of fall, as his horse climbed the ridge that looked out over Blackwood Hollow. It looked neat and even prosperous from a distance, but as he got closer, he felt the same wrongness that had bothered Reverend Shaw settle over him like a shroud. No one came out to say hello. The front door was slightly open and creaked in the wind. Ryland got off his horse and called out, his hand on the revolver at his hip. Only silence answered him, heavy and oppressive, except for the lowing of neglected cattle that sounded like they were hungry. He stepped over the threshold into a house that would reveal secrets worse than anything he could have imagined. Secrets written down in 2 ledgers that would be the most damning evidence ever shown in an Ozark courtroom. When Sheriff Ryland first walked into the Croft house, he thought it looked like a house that had been frozen in time, as if the people who lived there had stopped moving. On the 4th of November, 1853, he filed an official report with the county clerk that went into great detail about what he found that morning. There was a lot of dust on everything, and it was thick enough to see mouse tracks on the kitchen table. There were half-eaten meals on tin plates that were getting cold, and the leftovers were crawling with bugs that ran away when he got close. The bread had turned green with mold, and the coffee in the tin cups had turned into dark rings. Ryland thought the scene hadn't been touched in at least 3 weeks, and maybe even longer. He told his deputies to come inside and not touch anything until he had written down everything about the house. At first, it seemed like simple abandonment, but as he moved from room to room, the things he wrote down in his notebook with his pencil became more and more urgent. The main living area showed that the family used to live in a very orderly way. Bibles were on the side tables, and their spines were cracked from being read so often. A sampler on the wall carefully stitched the Lord's mercy. Jedediah Croft's study, on the other hand, was the first real proof of the darkness that had been growing inside these walls. Ryland found not only the Bible, but also pamphlets with disturbing titles on the desk. These included publications on bloodline purity, crude anatomical charts showing how humans reproduce in great detail, and medical books talking about heredity and what the authors called racial improvement, ideas that had started to spread in some intellectual circles back east. Ryland had read about these kinds of theories in newspapers, where most people thought they were just the crazy ideas of fake scientists. But here, they had been studied with great care. Jedediah's handwriting filled the margins with notes about his own family and calculations about how to get pregnant that made Ryland sick to his stomach. He carefully gathered these items, noting the time and place of each find in his evidence log. A deputy called from the bedroom with news that made the mystery even more interesting. Altha Croft's dresses were in the closet, her personal things were on the dresser, and her Bible was on the nightstand with a ribbon marking the book of Proverbs. No woman would willingly leave behind things like these. Ryland saw bloodstains on the bedding that were old and brown, and there seemed to be more stains on the floor that someone had tried to clean up. The pattern showed a lot of blood loss, which is more than what a small injury could explain. He wrote down the stains in his notebook and measured them with a piece of string that he later kept as proof. The bedroom window looked out over the property's outbuildings. From this angle, Ryland could see freshly turned earth behind the barn, a dark rectangle of soil that stood out against the grass that had gone dormant for winter. Ryland sent a deputy to ask the nearest neighbor, a farmer named Thomas Birch, who lived half a mile down the valley, some questions. Birch's testimony, which was recorded that same afternoon, gave important information about the timeline. He said that the last time he saw the Croft family was in the middle of October, maybe 3 weeks ago. Birch said the twins had been digging behind the barn with cold fury, their faces blank and their movements stiff. When he asked what they were digging up, Silas or Elias, he could never tell them apart, said they were building a new root cellar on their uncle's orders. Birch thought this was strange for the time of year, but he didn't think much of it at the time. It was even more disturbing that he had seen Altha Croft months earlier in the summer, when her belly was swollen in a way that made it look like she was pregnant. The Crofts had been married for more than 20 years and had no children. They had kept this late pregnancy a secret from the community on purpose. Birch remembered how angry Jedediah got when he brought it up. It was so bad that Birch never brought it up again. Sheriff Ryland's investigation really got going when he went back to the kitchen and saw a door that he had thought was a pantry. It went down to a cellar, but this cellar door was different from any other Ryland had seen. It had a heavy new padlock on the outside, and the metal was still shiny and not rusty. A well-placed iron hasp held the lock in place. It was bolted into the door frame with great care. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure that whatever was below couldn't get away. As Ryland looked at the mechanism, his heart began to race. His notes from this time, which are kept in the county archive, say exactly what he told his deputies. "Get the pry bar from my saddle. Whatever truth we're looking for is down there, and I don't think we'll like what we find." The deputies did as they were told, and within minutes, Ryland had the heavy bar wedged against the hasp. The metal creaked and then broke with a loud crack that echoed through the empty house. As soon as the cellar door opened, a thick, foul wave of air rushed up, making all three men stagger back and gag. It was the unmistakable smell of death, human waste, and rot that was concentrated in the dark below. Ryland held a match over the dark entrance to the cellar and covered his mouth and nose with his neckerchief. The flickering light showed stone steps going down into the dark, and at the bottom, shapes that his mind couldn't understand at first. He slowly went down, writing down each step in his report with the clinical precision of a man forcing himself to bear witness to the unbearable, knowing that only careful evidence would bring justice for whatever horror awaited him in the dark. The cellar that Sheriff Ryland went down into that November morning would become the most documented crime scene in Missouri Ozark history, with every detail recorded in sketches and testimony that filled 30 pages of court records. The flickering light from the lamp showed a room of planned suffering, a space that had been turned from a simple storage area into a prison meant to kill people slowly. The bodies of Jedediah and Altha Croft were chained to opposite walls, with a dirt floor between them that was about 12 feet wide. The bodies were very decomposed, but it was clear how they had been held captive. They had heavy agricultural chains around their ankles that were tied to iron rings that had been driven deep into the stone foundation. Ryland said that the rings looked like they had just been put in, and the mortar around them was still a lighter color than the stone around them. Each victim could move about 3 feet of chain, which was enough to change positions, but not enough to reach the other person or the stairs to the basement. Water buckets were just out of their reach, which was a cruel move that showed how carefully they were being kept. Ryland's first look, which he did with a handkerchief pressed to his face to block out the horrible smell, showed that both victims had died from lack of food and water. Jedediah's body was slumped against the wall, and his clothes were loose on a frame that was mostly made of skeleton and leather. His hands showed signs of desperate clawing at the stone. His fingernails were ripped off, and there was dried blood on the wall, where he had scraped until his flesh gave out. The remains of Altha told a worse story. It looked like she had died in the middle of the cellar floor, and the dirt underneath her was stained with a lot of old blood, much more than what was still in her body. Ryland's report said that there were pieces of fabric that looked like underwear and a stained dress in a pile in the corner. The way she lost blood, and the way her body was positioned, showed that she had a violent miscarriage here, alone, with her husband chained up and only able to watch from the other side of the darkness. There had been no medical help and no mercy. She had bled and died on packed earth, with iron holding her in place. But the real clue that would turn this from a murder investigation into something much more complicated was on a wooden crate that had been placed between the two bodies on purpose. Ryland raised his lamp and saw an open ledger with a cover that was dirty and wet, as if it had been left there for someone to find. He picked it up carefully, held it up to the light, and started to read. The writing was rough, almost unreadable in some places, and there were spelling mistakes and letters that were hard to make. But the message was very clear. Every page told the story of how Jedediah and Althea Croft were systematically starved. Entries with dates, starting in the middle of October and going on for weeks. The twins had kept a diary of revenge with the same level of detail that their bully had taught them. Each entry said whether or not water was given, wrote down the prisoners' pleas for mercy, and wrote down confessions that were forced out of them by lack of food. The handwriting changed between two different styles, which suggests that Silas and Elias took turns writing down what they saw and heard about their uncle's decline. One entry from October 21st read, "Uncle begs today, says he was, teaching us strength. We give him no water. He taught us to keep good records, so we keep them." Another from October 26th stated, "Altha screams, bleeding bad. Uncle cries and pulls chains. We watch like he watched us." This is lesson he taught. The clinical detachment with which the twins recorded Altha's miscarriage was perhaps the most disturbing element of the ledger. They talked about how much pain she was in the same detached way that Jedediah had talked to them, listing the hours of labor, the amount of blood, and the moment she stopped moving. They had learned a lot from their uncle. The last entry, from November 2nd, had only 4 words: "The debt is paid." The handwriting looked steadier and more certain than any of the other entries. Ryland stood in that cellar with this confession and knew right away that he was dealing with something the law had never properly prepared him to judge. The sheriff told his deputies to write down everything before they moved the bodies. They drew a map of the cellar, measured the chains, and wrote down where everything was. Ryland picked up the ledger himself and carefully wrapped it in oilcloth to keep it as proof. He knew this document would be very important to any prosecution because it was a written confession to murder that made it clear what the twins had done. But even as he put it in his saddlebag, he was worried about what it meant. This was not a crime of passion or rage that came out of nowhere. It was planned, carried out, and recorded with terrible accuracy. It was as if the twins wanted everyone to know exactly what they had done and why, so they made their own evidence and testimony. Ryland climbed back up the stairs to the cellar, bringing with him not only proof of murder, but also the start of a moral question that would haunt the county for months. Before he left, Ryland looked at the area behind the barn that neighbor Birch had said had just been dug up. It was about 8 feet by 10 feet and had been dug out to a depth of about 6 feet before it was left alone. The size and depth were like those of a grave, but it was just empty dirt. It was clear from Ryland's notes that the twins had been digging their uncle and aunt's grave even before they locked them up in the cellar. This was premeditation of the most careful kind. But Ryland also wrote something else in his official report that would later be important during the trial. There were rough wooden crosses of child size scattered around the excavation. They had initials and dates on them that suggested stillbirths or infant deaths going back years. It seemed that the Crofts' marriage without children wasn't because they couldn't have kids. The earth itself now showed that there were graves hidden where no one would ask questions. The search for Silas and Elias Kane started right after Sheriff Ryland came out of the Croft cellar with proof of a double murder, but it turned out to be unnecessary in any normal sense. The twins didn't run away to faraway places or try to hide among the anonymous people who lived in growing frontier cities. They were instead found on the 5th of November, 1853, living in a simple lean-to less than 3 miles from the farm. It was built in a hollow where they had apparently been camping since locking their uncle and aunt in the cellar. A hunting party led by Ryland found them with almost too much ease, as if the brothers had been waiting for them to be found. Neither twin tried to run away or fight back when the posse surrounded their camp at dawn. They just stood there, thin but strangely calm, and let themselves be put in chains without saying a word of protest or denial. The report on Ryland's arrest said they were very skinny, their clothes were ripped and dirty, but their eyes were clear and focused, showing none of the wild desperation of people trying to escape justice. The trip back to the county jail was the first sign that these weren't just regular criminals trying to avoid punishment. As Ryland got ready to take them away, Silas, or maybe Elias, the sheriff still couldn't tell them apart, reached into the lean-to and got a package wrapped in oilcloth. Without saying a word, he handed it to Ryland. When the sheriff opened it, he found a second ledger that was older and bigger than the confession book from the cellar that was covered in dirt. The leather cover was in good shape and had Jedediah Croft's initials on it. Ryland opened it carefully, and what he read in the first few pages made him so angry that he had to force himself to calm down. Jedediah wrote this with his own hand and words, documenting years of systematic abuse in prose that tried to hide the horror in the language of scientific inquiry and moral duty. The twins had kept their uncle's journal safe and sound, and now they were willing to give it to the police as proof that would convict them while also explaining what they had done. The ledger that became Exhibit A in the trial of Silas and Elias Kane listed crimes that shocked even frontier towns that were used to violence and strict discipline. Jedediah started writing in the spring of 1849, when the twins were about 13 years old, had just lost their parents, and were completely reliant on their aunt and uncle's charity. His first few sentences showed that he had been influenced by the fake scientific ideas about bloodline purity that had been going around in some pamphlets and journals. He said that the Cain family line was weak because of inbreeding, which is a common insult against isolated Ozark clans. He also said that he wanted to do experiments that would prove some ideas about heredity and purification. What came next were pages and pages of documented abuse, clinical descriptions of acts so horrible that the county prosecutor would later read only parts of them aloud in court, with warnings to spectators that the full content was too disturbing for public recitation. Jedediah had tortured his nephews on purpose, writing down their reactions like a naturalist would write down the behavior of animals in the wild. He did this to break down their supposedly corrupt bloodline. The entries that said he used Altha as an unwilling subject in his experiments were the most damning. Jedediah wrote down how he made his wife do things with the twins that he thought would either lead to pregnancy or prove his theories about genetic weakness. He wrote down dates, explained how things worked, and noted results with mechanical accuracy, showing no sign that he knew he was confessing to crimes that broke every law of God and man. Several entries talked about Altha's failed pregnancies and miscarriages, which she kept to herself, while Jedediah changed his approach and tried again. The ledger made it clear that Altha's pregnancy that ended in the cellar was not her first. It was her last. Jedediah had blamed each previous loss on a flaw in his method, not the evil of his actions. He had kept records because he really thought he was doing important work by writing down knowledge that future generations could learn from. His complete lack of moral awareness, written down in his own handwriting, would be more damning than any evidence the prosecution could come up with. Sheriff Ryland sat at his desk with both ledgers, the Book of Sins and the Book of Retribution, open in front of him. He knew that he had proof of a tragedy that couldn't be easily classified under Missouri law. The twins were guilty of murder, and their own ledger showed that they had planned to kill someone. Jedediah's journal, on the other hand, recorded years of abuse that were so bad that they made it hard to see the twins as just criminals acting out of evil intent. On November 6th, Ryland started taking formal statements from Silas and Elias. What came out was probably worse than silence would have been. The brothers took turns talking, finishing each other's sentences and explaining in flat, emotionless voices exactly what they had done and why. The county clerk wrote down exactly what they said, and it was just as precise as their written ledger. They said that Uncle Jedediah had taught them how important it was to keep good records and write down everything so that the truth couldn't be denied or forgotten. They had just used what he had taught them to do, their last act of defiance. Silas said, "He taught us that learning requires observation over time. We observed him the way he observed us. We kept records the way he taught us. We completed his final experiment." The twins showed no remorse, no satisfaction, no emotion at all. They had carried out a kind of justice that was not based on any laws, using the same methods that their abuser had used. Elias said they always meant to get caught, and that running away would have made their actions look like crimes committed in shame instead of judgments made with full knowledge. They stayed close to the farm, kept both ledgers safe, and waited for the police to find them so that the whole truth could come out. Ryland wrote down every word, knowing that this confession, along with the physical evidence in both ledgers, would make a case that the Missouri courts had never seen before. Justice was on its way, but what shape it would take was still a question that would tear the county apart. On the 14th of March, 1854, the trial of Silas and Elias Cain began in a county courthouse that was so full of people that it couldn't hold any more. People had come from all over the Missouri Ozarks to see how frontier justice would deal with a moral problem that had never happened before. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Hargrave, had so much evidence that it seemed like the defendant would be found guilty right away. The twins' own ledger had a day-by-day confession to murder, written by them and sealed with their last words. The debt was paid. Every detail was backed up by physical evidence. The chain still had marks from the victim's desperate struggles. The cellar floor still had bloodstains that matched Altha's last suffering, and Sheriff Ryland's careful records left no questions about the facts. Hargrave stood in front of the jury and said that no matter what horrible things happened before the murders, the law only allowed one punishment for such planned cruelty: He ordered that Silas and Elias Cain be hanged by the neck until they died, and their bodies be buried in unmarked graves for the worst criminals the state had ever prosecuted. Samuel Pritchard, the defense attorney, had to argue for leniency, even though the defendant had already confessed. He had turned down the case at first, but community pressure made him take it. But Pritchard had his own powerful exhibit, Jedediah Croft's Ledger, a leather-bound book that documented 5 years of systematic abuse. The defense didn't deny the murders. Instead, they tried to show that they were the only logical outcome of the twins' suffering, which had made it impossible for them to make normal moral decisions. Pritchard read parts of Jedediah's journal to the court. His voice broke as he talked about things that made grown men in the jury box cry and made several women in the gallery run out in tears. He showed medical evidence from a doctor who had looked at the twins and found scars and other signs of long-term abuse that backed up everything Jedediah said in his own handwriting. The doctor's report, which was entered as Defense Exhibit 12, showed injuries that were consistent with years of torture. This was proof that the twins' bodies were evidence of crimes their uncle had proudly recorded. The trial turned into a show that split the county into 2 groups that hated each other. Some people said that the law should be fully enforced no matter what, saying that letting revenge killings go unpunished would lead to chaos in society, where everyone who was hurt would become a judge and executioner. Some people thought the twins were victims who had carried out a kind of biblical justice that the law had not been able to provide. They did this because no adult authority had stepped in to stop Jedediah's crimes. The Ozark Courier, a local newspaper, published daily accounts of testimony that were reprinted in newspapers all over Missouri and even made it to papers in St. Louis and Kansas City. Editorials were just as passionate about both sides of the issue. Ministers used the case as proof of either the sinful nature of people or God's mysterious plan to free the oppressed from their chains. Sheriff Ryland put armed deputies all over the courtroom because things were getting so heated. He also said he would clear the gallery if order was not kept. The prosecution's closing argument stressed that the foundation of civilization is the idea that personal revenge cannot take the place of legal justice. They said that the twins had become the very monsters they claimed to oppose by torturing people and documenting their suffering in the same cold way their uncle had done. Hargrave held up both ledgers and said they were equally bad. They were both accounts of inhuman cruelty that only differed in who did it and who was the victim. The defense said that no sane person could have lived through what Jedediah did. They said that the twins' mechanical recitation of events and lack of emotion showed that years of planned abuse had destroyed their ability to make normal decisions. Pritchard said that hanging them would only finish what their uncle had started, killing boys who had been dead in spirit long before they ever chained anyone up in a cellar. The jury got both ledgers as Exhibit A and Exhibit B, the 2 most important pieces of evidence that any verdict must be based on. They then went to talk about the hardest choice any of them would ever have to make. It took the jury 3 days to reach a decision that would be used as a legal precedent in Missouri for years to come. Jacob Stillwell, a farmer who was the foreman, read the decision with shaking hands and said that the jury found Silas and Elias Cain guilty of first-degree murder. People in the courtroom shouted both good and bad things before Ryland brought order back. Stillwell wasn't done, though. He went on to say that the jury officially refused to recommend hanging, even though the crime was planned. Instead, they asked the court to give the longest prison sentence possible under the law. Judge Horace Payton, who was clearly having a hard time with his own feelings, agreed with the jury's recommendation and sentenced both twins to life in prison at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. They would be taken out of society forever, but their lives would be spared. This was a compromise that recognized how serious their actions were and how unusual the situation that led to them was. The official court record showed the sentence on the 23rd of March, 1854. This brought the case to a legal end, but it would never find a moral end. In April 1854, Silas and Elias Cain were taken to Jefferson City with a lot of guards. They were chained together as they had been since their arrest, spoke little, and didn't react to the sentence that would end their lives. Records from the prison show that Silas died of pneumonia in 1859 when he was about 23 years old. His body was buried in the prison cemetery with only a number to mark his grave. Elias lived to be an old man and became a model prisoner. He worked in the prison library, where he cataloged books with the same care his uncle had taught him. He never talked about Blackwood Hollow, never had visitors, and never asked for a pardon or parole, even though he could have after 30 years. When he died in 1897, at the age of about 61, prison officials found his cell empty of personal items, except for a small notebook in which he had copied word for word every entry from his and Silas's revenge ledger. This was done to keep their testimony safe in case the original was ever lost. The county records building still has both ledgers, Jedediah's journal, Sheriff Ryland's full case file, all of the courtroom testimony, and the physical evidence, like the chains and blood-stained clothes. The case files are kept in 4 big boxes in the basement vault. Researchers can look at them if they sign a waiver saying they understand how disturbing the contents are. The county took the Croft farm for unpaid taxes, and in 1858 it burned down in a fire that was thought to have been started on purpose. That land was never used to build anything again. The silence that Reverend Shaw first noticed in 1853 came back to Blackwood Hollow and has never been broken. It seems like the earth itself doesn't want anyone to live there anymore. Where such evil once thrived and such terrible justice was finally served,